I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had survived family rebellion, public humiliation, and years of private tension. But nothing prepared him for the document placed before him inside Windsor. Written under the authority of the late Queen, sealed away from ordinary royal files, it carried one devastating instruction. Princess Charlotte was to hold a position of dynastic precedence above Camilla in matters tied to Elizabeth's private legacy. Charles read the line twice. Then the king stopped speaking. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept one hand near the page, but could not touch it again. The private Windsor Review had begun as an examination of restricted family records, but the locked succession archive, a secure collection holding sensitive instructions about royal continuity and inheritance, produced something unexpected. An archivist removed a sealed decree carrying Queen Elizabeth II's personal mark and delivered it to the monarch. That decree, a written royal instruction preserving a specific decision, was never cancelled, amended, or folded into later palace arrangements. It was still alive. The words were brutally clear. Princess Charlotte outranked Camilla in every ceremonial and inheritance matter connected to Elizabeth's private family legacy, including designated trusts, personal jewels, and dynastic representation. Charles lowered the paper and stared at the table. His mother left no room for interpretation. She had placed his granddaughter ahead of his wife, and the decision mattered because these private holdings carried more than value. They carried memory, family identity, and the right to represent Elizabeth's personal line. Camilla entered expecting a routine conversation. She stopped and felt the tension. The queen consort asked whether something had gone wrong, but he would not meet her eyes. Instead, the king asked her to sit. She obeyed, watching him closely, and her unease deepened when he turned the document away. Then Charles noticed the handwriting beneath the formal clause. Elizabeth had ordered the decree activated only when Camilla's position began overlapping with assets or duties reserved for the monarch's direct descendants. The instruction was preserved in a documented archival account attached to the decree, making its purpose impossible to dismiss. His wife was not simply excluded from Charlotte's future. She had triggered the condition his mother had anticipated. Charles finally understood the wound. This was not only about a young princess inheriting protected responsibilities. It was a judgment on Camilla's place inside the family, written years earlier and waiting for the moment when boundaries blurred. And when Charles finally lifted his eyes toward Camilla, the pain on his face told her the truth before he said a single word. This was not a simple contest of rank. On one side stood Camilla, the woman Charles had defended through decades of scandal, resentment, and judgment. On the other stood Princess Charlotte, a young granddaughter who had never asked to become the center of a royal reckoning. And between them sat a king suddenly forced to confront something unbearable. Queen Elizabeth had made a choice Charles himself had spent years trying to avoid. Charles felt the old battles return at once. He had spent years defending Camilla, absorbing public anger and family resistance, because he believed acceptance was finally secured. The queen consort, the wife of the reigning monarch, sharing his public life without inheriting sovereign authority, had endured enough in his eyes. He had told her that her place would never again be questioned. Now the decree made that promise feel painfully false. Charlotte knew none of this. Her place in Elizabeth's private legacy existed separately from ordinary court rank, meaning it concerned family trusts, personal inheritance, and symbolic duties rather than the formal order of succession. That distinction mattered because the young princess represented the monarch's direct bloodline, but she had never asked for influence. When William sent her a message asking her to remain close to home, she felt uneasy. The prince called soon after, and his daughter asked why adults kept mentioning her name behind closed doors. William chose every word with care. He knew a restricted file had been opened, but the future king refused to tell Charlotte that her great-grandmother's decree had placed her above Camilla in family matters. He told her only that an instruction had resurfaced and that Charles needed time. Charlotte accepted the answer, yet her uncertainty remained, and William heard it in her voice. Camilla looked at the folder again. She recognized Elizabeth's seal and felt her breathing change. The seal, a mark used to confirm the late monarch's authority over the document, removed any hope that this was a later interpretation. She asked Charles quietly whether his mother had left instructions specifically about her. The king did not answer. His silence lasted only seconds, but to her it felt like years. That silence changed everything. Charles remembered reassuring his wife. Charlotte waited for answers she did not understand, and William stood between a child and a truth too heavy to hand her carelessly. Yet one question mattered more than all the others. Why had Elizabeth created such an extraordinary safeguard in the first place? To understand why the Queen placed Charlotte above Camilla, the family would have to return to the afternoon when Elizabeth decided a private line had finally been crossed. Every hidden decree has a beginning. This one began during a private Windsor inheritance ceremony that was never meant to become controversial. Elizabeth had gathered a small group of family members to discuss the future custody of personal jewels and heirlooms linked to the direct royal line. The meeting should have lasted less than an hour. Instead, one exchange involving Camilla and a small velvet case changed the Queen's thinking forever. Elizabeth had always drawn a hard line around her personal family possessions. Crown assets belonged to the institution, but private heirlooms could be assigned by the monarch to specific relatives and carried through the direct family line. That difference mattered because Charles and Camilla had become involved in talks about future royal representation, and the question of who would control Elizabeth's private legacy was becoming harder to ignore. Camilla reached toward the velvet case during the Windsor legacy ceremony, a private family meeting used to discuss the future custody of personal heirlooms. Inside rested a brooch Elizabeth had already reserved for Charlotte. The Queen Consort asked whether it might instead be placed within the future consort collection, meaning the group of pieces intended for the reigning monarch's spouse. Before she could lift the case, Elizabeth placed one hand over it. Charles felt the room change. His mother said the brooch had already been assigned, and the coldness in her voice struck him harder than the words. Camilla withdrew her hand and said nothing. Elizabeth moved to the next item, but the monarch did not look at her again, and Charles knew the moment had cut deeper than anyone admitted. Charles confronted Elizabeth privately that evening. He asked whether she had meant to embarrass Camilla in front of the family. The Queen listened, then answered with a sentence preserved later in a documented account from her private secretary. Boundaries only feel cruel when someone has ignored them. He left unsettled, while she remained firm. Elizabeth acted the next morning. She summoned her private secretary and dictated the first framework of the decree, a binding written instruction protecting Charlotte's precedence within her personal dynastic estate, meaning the private inheritance she had set aside for direct descendants. The monarch then added a clause preventing any spouse of a reigning sovereign from overriding a direct descendant in matters she had specifically marked as bloodline inheritance. Years later, Charles understood. Camilla had remembered the embarrassment. Elizabeth had remembered the reach toward the case. And now the Queen Consort was about to challenge the consequence face to face. The past had finally entered the room, and this time, Charles could not stand between Camilla and the judgment his mother had left behind. Camilla did not shout when Charles finished reading the decree. That made the moment worse. She sat perfectly still, staring at the document as though the late Queen had somehow returned to the room through those carefully chosen words. Then she asked one question, quietly, painfully. Did she never trust me? Charles looked away, and in that hesitation, decades of unresolved resentment suddenly broke through the palace walls. Charles forced himself to answer. He explained that the decree concerned Elizabeth's private legacy, not the formal order of succession, which is the legal sequence deciding who becomes monarch. But he knew the distinction could not soften the wound. Charlotte's precedence reached into reserved jewels, family trusts, commemorative representation, and decisions carrying Elizabeth's personal authority. Those matters held memory and influence, and Camilla understood exactly what exclusion from them meant. Camilla pushed her chair back. No aides were present. No secretary stood nearby to turn pain into careful palace language. She looked directly at Charles, and asked whether he had always known his mother considered her temporary inside the dynasty. The king denied it immediately. He had never seen the decree, he insisted, and he had never known Elizabeth had prepared such a boundary. Camilla's anger sharpened. She reminded him of the years she had endured hostility, whispers, and public judgment, because he kept asking her to trust that acceptance would come. Charles had promised the struggle would end. Yet the queen consort now faced proof that the late monarch had created a safeguard against her reach, and Charles had spent years offering comfort without understanding the danger waiting beneath it. Charles finally turned the page. He showed her the handwritten activation clause, a private instruction explaining when the decree must take effect. Then, in their recorded private conversation preserved in a fictional household account, he admitted why the file had surfaced. Camilla's household had recently requested administrative authority over part of Elizabeth's private collection. That request triggered the archival review. Camilla stopped moving. Her anger vanished so suddenly that Charles almost preferred the fury. She looked again at the paper and understood the unbearable truth. Her own request had opened the locked door. She had not merely discovered Elizabeth's decision, she had activated it. That changed everything. Because William was not protecting an abstract tradition, he was protecting his daughter from the conflict unfolding. Camilla rose slowly and asked one final question. Who now had the power to enforce the decree? Charles hesitated, then answered with one name: William. Camilla had believed the battle was between herself and a dead queen, but the decree had placed its enforcement in the hands of the future king. Prince William did not celebrate when the decree reached him. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of revenge. He closed the file, rested both hands on the desk, and understood exactly what his grandmother had done. Elizabeth had protected Charlotte without turning a child into a weapon. Now William faced the harder responsibility. He had to enforce the Queen's order, while ensuring his daughter never believed a family conflict had been created in her name. William read the decree again, slower this time. Elizabeth had named the direct heir as guardian of its dynastic clauses, the private rules protecting her chosen family legacy. That made the prince responsible for Charlotte's precedence. Charles remained king, but even the monarch could not simply erase Elizabeth's inheritance instructions without challenging the trust framework she had created to keep those private wishes intact. William felt anger rise when he learned that Charlotte's reserved legacy had been touched by an administrative request. He could accept confusion, he could accept argument, but he would not allow his daughter's name to become a lever in an adult struggle. Still, the future king refused to humiliate Camilla. Public punishment would turn protection into revenge, and he knew Elizabeth had designed the decree to prevent exactly that kind of damage. Catherine watched him reread the page. She noticed his jaw tighten each time Charlotte's name appeared, and quietly told him their daughter had to remain a child, not a palace symbol. William looked at her, then back at the file. The Princess of Wales had named his deepest fear. If he handled this badly, Charlotte would inherit not only Elizabeth's legacy, but the bitterness surrounding it. William made the decision. He ordered Charlotte's designated holdings separated immediately from all Queen Consort household administration. The Queen Consort household meant the staff and offices managing Camilla's official work, and removing those holdings activated Elizabeth's safeguard in full. His instruction was recorded in a formal private memorandum, leaving no doubt about how enforcement began. Then William found another envelope. Elizabeth had sealed an explanatory note inside the file, and its documented wording stopped him cold. Charlotte, she wrote, represented continuity without claim. The meaning was brutal in its simplicity. The girl had been chosen precisely because she had no power to demand the legacy for herself. William closed the note and prepared to tell Charles that enforcement had already begun. He did not yet know Camilla had made one final attempt to stop the transfer before the boundary became irreversible. But as William moved to protect Charlotte, Camilla reached for the only authority she believed could still save her position: the king himself. The fallout did not arrive with trumpets or dramatic announcements. It came quietly. A meeting disappeared from Camilla's schedule. A private collection briefing was redirected. 2 folders that once passed through her household were sent directly to William's office. Each change looked small in isolation. Together, they delivered a brutal message. The decree was no longer an old document hidden in Windsor. It was active, and Camilla could feel her influence narrowing by the hour. Camilla noticed the pattern before anyone explained it. Elizabeth's private collections, designated family trusts, and every matter linked to Charlotte's legacy were being transferred away from her household. These trusts were arrangements holding assets for relatives, and the change mattered because control of information often meant influence over decisions. Charles was told the order did not remove his wife's title. It simply created a permanent boundary between her position and the late Queen's bloodline estate. Camilla opened a revised briefing folder and froze. 3 entire sections were gone. She turned one page, then another, as if the missing material might somehow return. It did not. The Queen Consort slowly closed the folder and asked her aide to leave. When the door shut, she remained silent, staring at the cover after the room emptied. Charles found her that way. He sat beside Camilla and tried to reassure her that she remained his queen. But she answered without looking at him. Being his wife, she said, was clearly not the same as belonging to the dynasty. The king felt the words land. He had spent years believing love could protect her from old wounds, yet Elizabeth's decree had exposed a limit even he could not erase. Charles then admitted the truth. William had already enacted the protection order, a formal instruction separating Charlotte's protected legacy from Camilla's administrative reach. Reversing it now would create a conflict with Elizabeth's recorded wishes. The monarch could challenge his son, but doing so would turn a private boundary into family war. Camilla revealed, through a documented household account of their private conversation, that she had asked the archive office to delay the changes. The request was rejected. Once the decree was authenticated, Charlotte's precedence became automatic. Camilla lowered her eyes. Her last attempt had failed before Charles knew she had made it. Charles could no longer bear the distance growing around them. Devastated by her isolation and his own helplessness, he decided to meet William alone. No courtiers, no lawyers, no advisors. For the first time since the decree surfaced, father and son would meet not as king and heir, but as 2 men divided by the final command of a woman they both loved. There were no private secretaries in the room when Charles met William, no legal binders, no prepared palace language. The king entered carrying only Elizabeth's decree, while his son waited beside a table with the explanatory note already open. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Charles asked William to answer him honestly. Was he protecting Charlotte because the Queen ordered it, or because part of him believed Camilla should never have reached this far? Charles did not soften the question. He accepted William's responsibility under the private trust framework, a structure protecting Elizabeth's personal assets and written instructions after her death. But the monarch asked whether strict enforcement had to come without compassion. Camilla still stood beside him publicly, and every removal from her reach was becoming another private wound. William held his father's gaze. He made clear he had no intention of attacking Camilla's dignity or turning the Queen Consort into a public target. His only purpose was protecting boundaries Elizabeth had documented. The prince knew those boundaries mattered because once private wishes could be bent by family pressure, Charlotte's inheritance would no longer be protected by principle. It would depend on whoever argued the hardest. Charles admitted what he had carried into the room. He felt he had failed Camilla again. Worse, reading his mother's decree had felt like losing Elizabeth a second time. The king had spent years defending one woman, only to discover another had left behind a decision he could not escape. William's expression softened. William answered quietly. Protecting Charlotte did not require destroying Camilla, he said. But refusing the decree would teach his daughter that a woman could write her wishes, preserve them, and still have them erased when the family became uncomfortable. The future king then opened Elizabeth's explanatory note and read the documented line again, continuity without claim. Charles listened as his son explained it. Charlotte had been chosen because she held no household authority and possessed no power to demand the assets herself. Elizabeth was protecting someone too young to fight for what had already been assigned to her. The decree was not a weapon against Camilla. It was a shield against adult ambition reaching into a child's inheritance. Charles lowered his eyes, then nodded. For the first time, he accepted the difference. Father and son agreed on one response. They would respect the decree, protect Charlotte, and refuse to humiliate Camilla. But when they left the room, the silence outside had broken. The existence of Elizabeth's order had escaped palace walls, and Britain was reacting. The family had finally understood Elizabeth's intention, but outside the palace, the story was about to become something far louder. By sunrise, the private decree was private no longer. Charlotte's name appeared beside Camilla's across breakfast tables, phone screens, and television studios throughout Britain. The public did not see trust clauses or archival safeguards. They saw something far simpler and far more explosive. Queen Elizabeth had reached from beyond her lifetime and placed a granddaughter ahead of a queen consort. Within hours, one newspaper front page turned the palace crisis into a national obsession. William saw the headline before breakfast and felt immediate dread. The authenticated existence of Elizabeth's decree had leaked, forcing the palace to acknowledge a private precedence arrangement without releasing the document itself. That arrangement meant Charlotte held protected authority in specific inheritance matters tied to the late monarch's personal legacy. Broadcasters carefully explained that this was separate from the line of succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the throne. But the public barely heard the distinction. Outside Windsor, the story took on a life of its own. A morning paper carried Charlotte's portrait beneath 3 enormous words: "The Queen's Final Choice." A small crowd gathered near the castle gates holding copies, arguing over whether Elizabeth had protected a child or delivered a final rebuke to Camilla. The image spread quickly. The symbolism was stronger than any legal explanation. William immediately instructed staff to keep newspapers away from the family breakfast table. The prince's first fear was Charlotte. He knew one headline could turn his daughter into a symbol before she even understood the battle around her. Catherine felt the same urgency. When the young princess asked why everyone seemed tense, her mother told her only that her great-grandmother had left something important in her care. The Princess of Wales refused to give adult conflict to a child. Camilla heard different words. A broadcaster described the decree as Elizabeth's last boundary, and the queen consort switched off the television before the segment ended. She had spent years surviving public judgment. Now the late queen's private instruction had become a national story, and she knew every silence from the palace would be read as resistance. Then the palace acted. A formal statement confirmed that Charles and William jointly respected Elizabeth's private instructions, ending speculation that the king would challenge the decree. The monarch had chosen unity. The future king had chosen protection. Britain now understood the decision. Charlotte remained guarded from the conflict. Camilla stood wounded by its meaning, and Charles faced the final conversation he could no longer delay. The argument over rank was over, but Charles still owed Camilla something no decree, title, or palace statement could give her: the truth. Charles returned to Camilla carrying no folder. He did not need one anymore. The decree had been authenticated, William had enforced it, and the palace had publicly accepted Elizabeth's wishes. Nothing remained to negotiate. But the king had spent his life learning that royal decisions and human pain rarely end at the same moment. He sat beside his wife and finally said what he had been unable to admit from the beginning. His mother's decision would stand. Camilla did not interrupt. Charles confirmed that Charlotte's precedence within Elizabeth's private dynastic legacy would remain permanent, and the crown would not challenge it. That legacy meant the late monarch's personally assigned family inheritance, including protected trusts, heirlooms, and symbolic duties reserved for direct descendants. The boundary mattered because it separated marriage from bloodline inheritance. Yet he also told his wife that her place beside him remained unchanged. She was still his partner, still the queen consort, still part of his public reign. Camilla twisted a ring between her fingers, then removed it and placed it on the table. She told Charles she had spent years fearing the family would never truly make room for her. The king listened, devastated. He admitted he could not rewrite his mother's judgment simply to ease their pain. But he promised he would no longer pretend that love gave either of them ownership over another person's legacy. Camilla finally understood what anger had hidden. Charlotte had taken nothing from her. Elizabeth had made the distinction years earlier, and the young princess had simply inherited a responsibility already waiting for her. The queen consort said this quietly in their recorded private conversation, and for the first time, Charles heard acceptance instead of resistance. Charles later saw Charlotte speaking softly with William and felt the meaning settle fully. The prince had protected his daughter without turning her into a weapon, while the child remained untouched by the bitterness surrounding her name. The late queen had drawn the boundary before future adults could fight over it. That was the true purpose of the decree. The crisis ended there. Charles accepted Elizabeth's order. William protected Charlotte. Camilla faced the painful limit of her place in the monarch's private legacy. Love, marriage, title, and inheritance were not the same, and the family could no longer pretend otherwise. And so the queen's hidden decree delivered its final judgment. Camilla would stand beside the king, but Charlotte would carry Elizabeth's private legacy forward. And this time, no one inside the monarchy would challenge the boundary again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.